share this one because this is what I said earlier, and I'll
Yeah.
pass it back to you. This is where AMLO, the Mexican president, rebukes U.S. State Department over the protest comments. The U.S. State Department, like he went after them in Mexico. There's this story as well. AMLO says Mexico is more democratic than oligarch-run U.S. Condemns State Department meddling against electoral reform. They must have took this other link down. Let me try to get this one. I'm trying to pull the one up where he condemns neoliberalism. Maybe might be my internet, but I'll pass to you, Andrew, while I get that pulled up. You want to comment? Do you want to comment on this story here?
Well, yeah. So what this story is about is the electoral reform. So there's a lot of different areas of Mexican domestic policy and also foreign policy where they've become very oppositional with the United States just by passing their own plan. Morena is a very left-wing progressive party. They didn't exist before 2012. In 2006 and 2012, AMLO won the numerical votes of both of those elections while he was running under the PRD, which is an older party that he used to be a part of. And then when he was screwed twice in a row, they created Morena. And so the electoral reform has been a big central part of their platform. They're also, Zoya just posted in the chat that Mexico earlier last year, they nationalized their lithium reserves. They actually, a day before that, they tried to pass a sweeping energy reform that was going to renationalize the entire oil industry, the entire electrical grid, and also boost production of hydropower, oil, nuclear power, and solar. And when that didn't pass, it got a majority of the votes, but it didn't pass because it required a super majority of votes to get the constitutional amendments that it needed to pass. And so because that didn't work, they just did a portion of it. But they have renationalized their oil company, Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex, and they have also nationalized the lithium industry. So Canada and the United States are pushing back. They're trying to flex through NAFTA 2.0 to force Mexico to allow more foreign investment into their oil sector and into their lithium and mining sector. They're also now criticizing this electoral reform where basically the PRI and PAN are the only two parties who had been in power before Morena for about 100 years. Well, I guess like 70 years. But it was kind of all out of the process of the Mexican Revolution, created what became PRI. PRI became corrupted, and it ran Mexico like, it was just completely privatizing everything ever since the late 70s, early 80s. And as a result, the electoral system in Mexico was drastically inflated with more money than it actually needs to run elections, because everything that the PRI and PAN were doing beforehand was just embezzling money and handing state assets to private individuals who are their friends. And so there have been huge protests in Mexico against election rigging since the 80s. If y'all want to look up a journalist, Regina Perez, I can't remember her other last name. She's a journalist who was really super adversarial, really good investigator since the 80s, and she was murdered in 2012 for her work, and her murder's never really been solved. But one story that she broke that was huge, that kind of built her career up to a national level, was the rigging of the 1986 election. And so this has been a huge problem in Mexico for a long time. So AMLO is cutting the funding to the electoral body and reforming how it works, because he's trying to cut out the really blatant election rigging that PRI and PAN have been doing for decades. And because of that, the old neoliberal parties, they're putting on, the best protests that they can. They're not really giant. They're definitely paying people to go there. And so the United States and some of their semi-private, semi-state media mouthpieces are saying, oh, AMLO's trying to become a dictator. He's trying to cheat in the elections, when actually this is just fulfilling his promise to clean up the electoral system, which has been a giant popular sticking point in the Mexican population for decades. And so there's pressure on energy, there's pressure on mining, there's pressure on AMLO to continue fighting the war on drugs, and now there's pressure on this electoral system. So I just said a bunch of shit there, but that's those are the three main areas where the US and Canada are pushing back at present. And this bill from Lindsey Graham it's nothing new, but I'll pause for a moment. But the next thing I wanted to bring up is that the U.S. is arming and funding.
Yeah, I'll bring that up because I have some reason, like these are literally my last links I can read because some reason my browser is really fucking up. So after these last receipts, I literally can't pull anything else up. Luckily, I have that one working. So I'm gonna ask you about this because this is very interesting. Lindsey Graham and Republicans are manufacturing consent to send military in Mexico because of the cartels. Meanwhile, the Gray Zone reported U.S. Special Forces trained Mexican drug cartels linked to decapitation, torture, and rape. So the U.S. Special Forces trained these people. Do you want to speak on that, Andrew?
Yeah. So this originally, well, I don't know if originally, but this story in particular goes back to the 80s. And in the 80s, you had the U.S. training death squads all across Latin America to murder indigenous people and socialists and peasant farmers in El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala and in Mexico. These people that the U.S. Special Forces trained, they were, I think, a paratrooper division in the Mexican military. And their first mission while they were still in the military was to wage really brutal warfare against the Zapatistas. The Zapatistas in the 90s, they're a group of indigenous people, communists, socialists, anarchists, and also just like sort of unpolitical peasant farmers who basically declared independence from Mexico when they passed NAFTA because they knew that NAFTA was going to wreck their economy. So these people that the U.S. Special Forces were training, they went to war against the Zapatistas in the mid-90s. And then after their tour in that campaign had kind of died down, they all defected en masse from the military. All these hundreds of people that U.S. Special Forces trained in really brutal warfare tactics, they defected from the Mexican military en masse, and they went to join the Zetas, who are sort of affiliated with the Gulf Cartel. And the Gulf Cartel, along with the Sinaloa Cartel, are one of these two cartels that the United States, most blatant neocons are talking about going to send the military in to fight right now. So there's a lot more I could say about this. The other thing I'll mention, if you can't bring it up, it's okay. People can find it. If you go on antiwar.com, there's an article from 2011 about the Fast and Furious. It's called Operation Fast and Furious.
Yeah, I wish I could pull it up. Unfortunately, my browser, like, I can't pull anything up for some reason. I don't want to mess it up because I don't want to mess the stream up. It may crash. So if you want to explain it, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's pretty quick. So the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Department, the ATF, they had a plan to give a bunch of illegal weapons to armed smugglers to take into Mexico, and they all went to cartels. And then a bunch of these weapons with American serial numbers, who are basically military grade weaponry. The Mexican police, the small portions of the police that actually were trying in the 80s not the 80s, the 2010s in Obama's middle of his administration, who were actually trying to push back against the cartels. Then they kept finding all these pretty heavy arms with serial numbers, then very easy to trace back to America. Again, there's no arms manufacturing in Mexico. Most of the weaponry is coming from the United States. And so then the ATF kind of got under pressure from different news agencies, especially independent journalists in the United States. And they were like, we did it on purpose. We were going to give these weapons to armed smugglers and let them get to cartels. And that way we could figure out who's in the cartels if we can arrest them and they have one of these guns. But that was a really thin defense for their behavior. What they were doing was arming the Sinaloa cartel. And so you have the two major cartels that these neocons in Congress are talking about going after in multiple material ways, have had training, armament, and more support from the United States government and its various organizations. So when AMLO says that the State Department should mind its own fucking business when it's talking about the electoral reform, I don't know if he's commented yet on the neocons talking about invading Mexico. But that is a really serious charge. It's not something that's just words. That's just to threaten Mexico rhetorically. I mean, it's pretty widely well known that about a third of the whole territory of the United States used to be part of Mexico. It was stolen from Mexico in a war of aggression in 1848, from 1846 to 1848. And so for them to say we have to invade Mexico to prevent fentanyl from coming over the border and prevent the cartels from killing Americans who are going to vacation in Mexico. Yeah, that is absolute nonsense. That is just a pretext to enforce Mexico to keep the capitalist policies that prop up the U.S. economy. And when Mexico is nationalizing its energy production to be energy sovereign, and when Mexico is trying to root out the corruption from their electoral system so the U.S. can't just as easily as possible tee up whoever they want to be the president of Mexico, who's going to give absolute deference to the United States and pass whatever version of NAFTA they want and do whatever militarized drug policy the U.S. asks them to, it is getting scarier. And so AMLO is honestly more, to my mind, like a non-aligned figure. The U.S. and Mexico are each other's biggest trading partners, and I think that AMLO has tried really hard to, in the energy reform bill that they were trying to pass, that would have renationalized multiple sectors before they had to fall back on just the mining and lithium reform. That included a ton of business with U.S. Engineering firms and corporations, and they'd even included, which they still did. They purchased for almost $1 billion, I think, an oil refinery in Texas to use for Mexican energy production. And so, AMLO has to tread very carefully, but I think that it's almost kind of reminds me how like Putin used to want to work with the West in the earlier parts of his presidency. And then after so many times of just trying to do, kind of minor sovereign decisions for Russia, eventually became very anti-West in his rhetoric and his stances. I see a somewhat similar trajectory with AMLO, although AMLO's been in politics for a long time. He's been a socialist for his whole time in politics, so it's really not exactly the same. But he was trying to be more friendly. He thought, Biden isn't rhetorically as shitty as Trump right now. Maybe we'll do some business. Maybe we can soften up the United States on some issues, and we can take our own decisions that might be more abrasive to somebody like Trump or Bush, and do our own thing in these other areas. But he's increasingly finding out that that's not true. And so then at this point, he has no reason to hold back. And so he's saying, yeah, I'll give asylum to Julian Assange, stop prosecuting Julian Assange. And he's saying, I'm going to lead the Latin American countries to go against the U.S. blockade of Cuba because it's against international law and it interferes. And it's a threat to all of our sovereignty. He stood up against the some of the Americas, like you said earlier, for the same reason. And so it's partly just a result of AMLO being who he is and Morena being a party that is new, built off of really popular momentum, and is accomplishing things that he's running into friction more and more with the U.S. It's kind of inevitable, but it is also the U.S. and Canada and others getting increasingly worried that Mexico is doing things that are in its own best interest, which means less profit for capitalists from around the world who have their industries extracting from Mexico.